Good morning. I'd like to introduce you to our panel moderator this morning. I wrote a very nice introduction of you, Liska, and it disappeared from my phone, but you'll be happy to know that you were replaced by Maria Popova and brain pickings. Liska Chan, who is going to be who is the moderator of this panel, is the Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon. She teaches a broad spectrum of landscape-related courses, including design studios, drawing, and critical art practice for designers. Her own creative practice involves mapping to examine and show the ways places such as New York City's Chinatown evolve over time. The work seeks to communicate the multiplicities of cultural and biophysical factors that constrain and direct landscape change. What I wanted to write a little bit more about was Overlook Farms, that Liska is the project coordinator for the summer program with students of landscape design from Oregon State. It's a 400-acre estate in Dalton, just down the road, for those of you who are not local. It's a wonderful local resource. The farm, which was designed in 1902 by the Olmsted Brothers, sorry. And it has recently been reimagined as a farm that highlights sustainability and taking advantage of the local assets of environment and so forth. And it's just a tremendous thing that they do. So Liska has very kindly agreed to moderate this panel on climate change.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. Push the on button. There we go. Technology. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and a real honor to be here. Working over this month, as Suzanne said, I'm teaching a group of students. We've got 10 students from the University of Oregon, Department of Landscape Architecture, doing work associated with the region, and our focus this year is waste, landscapes, and beauty. And it's been a fascinating topic. Each year we have a different topic. It's usually associated with some kind of productive landscapes, and so we've been very interested in the coal mining in this region and some of the acid mine drainage and other things that have been left behind, and sort of the challenges associated with that, as well as the economic challenges. So I'm just going to say a few words and then introduce our first speaker. I wrote a brief something just to get us thinking about climate change. So climate change is too big for us to wrap our heads around. Glasses. Even stories about rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and record high temperatures like those that grounded the airplanes in Phoenix last month. Even these stories are too large to capture our imaginations. Predicting change in the future is difficult and at times impossible. But what if we narrow the scope? So today we ask people who are experts in their own fields to speculate on 50-year scenarios. What is the future of your operation or field? And we ask, please imagine the impacts of climate change, how they might have impacts on your life, livelihood, and place. Our panelists, I will introduce all of them to start with, and then we'll begin with Brian Manning. So on my left is Dale Holen. I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves briefly. So Dale, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dale Holen. I'm a transplant from Wisconsin. I went to University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, if you're familiar with that area at all. I went to University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point for my undergraduate degree, and then UW-Wisconsin, Milwaukee for my master's and PhD, and then articulated to Penn State in 1994, where I was hired as an assistant professor of biology. I teach courses in evolution, lake and stream ecology, ecology of infectious diseases. I teach a non-majors course in genetics, ecology, and evolution. And my research discipline is I'm not a climatologist. I don't study climate change. I study algae in lakes, algae that are called mixotrophs. They're carnivorous. If you're familiar at all with sundew or pitcher plants, or which are carnivorous land plants, these are algae that basically eat each other or they eat bacteria. And at the time when I was a grad student, it was considered to be an anomaly, but that was 30 years ago. But now they're actually quite common. They're found in all lakes. And, this is it.
All right, thank you. So John Pulo.
Good morning. First, I'll tell you what I am, and then I'll tell you what I'm not. So what I am is a 1969 alum of Keystone College, which I'm very proud of. And I think everyone who's gone to Keystone has a story. I certainly have mine, but it was certainly a very shaping and influential period in my life. I'm also I'm also on the board of trustees. I'm entering my 6th year now, and really finding that to be an extraordinary experience, not only learning a great deal about higher education, but also an opportunity to give back to an institution that I really treasure. My background is primarily in business and technology. I am not a climate change expert by any means, but I do watch technologies, and most of the work I've done over the last 30 or 40 years has really been understanding the intersection of business and technology, and typically how technologies can become or create commercial worth of various types. And there are technologies and there are market economics and there are stakeholders in between, and figuring all that out turns out to be a pretty complex problem, but one I really enjoy solving and have tried to solve for the companies I've worked for over the years. I'm currently employed by a local firm by the name of Gentex Corporation. It's a privately held firm. It's over 100 years old. So I like stable institutions. So Keystone, of course, has been around for 150 years. But as a practical matter, we're a defense-related company, and our primary mission, our product mission, is saving and protecting lives, which is interesting in the military space by itself. So a lot of the work that I've done has really been trying to figure out how to create commercial worth and create and bring technology into the product environment to create best-in-class products to protect our not only our soldiers but also industrial workers that we serve as clients.
Brian.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Manning. I'm born and raised in this area. I'm a 4th-generation dairy farmer, which means our dairy farm has been somewhat of a stable, long-lasting business. This is our 97th year in business, so we're coming up on that 100 year. I went to school here, went to college at Cornell. I made the most of my time at Cornell by taking as many courses as I could. My primary concentration was in crop science, but I do have a background in engineering from Cornell, and bring that education to adapt farming to today's challenges. And many of today's challenges involve climate change. Even though we are just a small farm in Northeast Pennsylvania, and it's a far cry to call me an expert in my field, I kind of picture my field as different than most fields. Mine is an actual field.
Very good.
But gathering information from the previous generations who have worked the land, it is clear that things are changing, and the changes bring new challenges to us. And I think as a business, the only thing I can speak for is we need to adapt to survive. And I'll be highlighting some of the challenges we are facing and what we're trying to do to adapt.
Thank you. Bernie McGurl.
Okay. Thanks, Liska. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bernie McGurl, and I'm Executive Director of the Lackawanna River Conservation Association, which is a local watershed association working in the Lackawanna watershed, which is just over past Clark Summit. We're over here in the Tunkhannock watershed. So we work in a lot of with a lot of our fellow watershed organizations and conservation groups across northeastern Pennsylvania. I attended the University of Scranton studying political science and public administration, and also took some courses in several very enjoyable weekend semesters up here at Keystone, where I got to study some geology with Gus Blassis a few years ago. And I've been involved with the Lackawanna River Conservation Association for just around 30 years now. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary as a not-for-profit, community-based conservation association. We incorporated on October the 5th, 1987. And so we're not quite 97 years old yet, or 100, but I think we've a group of local folks got together to create the LRCA, and we recognized that we had some common interests in the Lackawanna River and its watershed. We recognized that the river needed some additional help. It started to recover from 100 years of mining and urban development, but people were still dumping things in it and dumping things along its riverbank up through the 1980s. And we created an organization that would help to turn that around, change the community's perspective, and change the community's attitudes, values, and behaviors. And I think we've been somewhat successful in doing that. I got involved initially as a volunteer, and then a few years later became the executive director, and I've been doing that pretty much as a labor of love. I enjoy the work, and I'm pleased to be on the panel today. Look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all, and I'll just explain how we're going to do this. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to introduce some ideas about the next 50 years in their field. And then we will have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A from the audience. So to begin, I'd like to ask Brian Manning to begin, please.
Certainly. To begin with, I'd like to, from a dairy farming perspective, hope you can understand that our business is a very diverse business. Not only are we livestock farmers, but we are also crop farmers. And even though it is such a local aspect that we're dealing with, it does have sort of global implications for how we run our business. So to start with, I'm going to start with a little bit of where we've been before I talk about where we're going. And where we've been, I can address that as recently as in the 90s when I was in college. I was able to come home on a weekend in May and start planting corn or start planting alfalfa to get the crop growing for the year. But what I've noticed, and this is because I like to keep records of when I've planted my crops, what the weather was like, so I can observe how things work. Having a little bit of a scientific background at college made me kind of a meticulous record keeper. So I like to look at what sort of situations I was dealing with the crop to see how it goes throughout the year. And I can adapt based on what has happened. And what's been happening in the past couple of years is the springs have been getting much wetter. And it's been harder to get out into the field to do my work. And when I could get back in early May and get my corn in the ground then, it's pushing my planting date further back. That's not to say that, the temperature's been colder. They've just been a little wetter. And having too much rain is sometimes as bad as having not enough rain. And so getting my crops in later has presented some problems with what crops I grow and what yields I'm looking for. Our farm is a vertically integrated dairy farm. So what that means is we grow all of the food for our cows on our farm. I purchase minimal inputs to feed my cows. I like to control the whole process, to know what my cows are getting, what the fields were like. So I try to be a really good steward of the environment, because I know the future kind of depends on what I do today. And the difficulty that's presented is if I can't get my crop in the ground in a timely fashion, I don't have the yield at the end of the year. And that has to deal with corn, that has to deal with soybeans, and has to do with my forage crops. For my cows' health, I try to have a very small portion of their diet come from grain. I want the majority of their diet to be from my forage crops. And I went from, in the early 90s, and what my father did and grandfather and great-grandfather did, where they pretty much planted a random grass crop, alfalfa, and corn. And what I've had to do is to adapt to what Mother Nature is giving me. And that's caused me to have a much more diverse crop plan for what I can grow. And that's moving towards a lot of summer annuals. And for people without a plant science background, that means the corn ground that I couldn't get planted because it was too wet, you lose a certain amount of yield. So I'm going to plant a crop that can take advantage of that warm weather. And a summer annual is a crop that I'm going to put in the ground and only get that summer harvest. So right now that's a crop like sorghum sudan grass. It's a real tall growing lush crop. It's relative to a tropical grass. And it's a good crop. The downside is it leaves no residue on the ground for the winter. And in order to hold the topsoil, you got to have some sort of residue. If you've ever looked out at a field after it's been combined and you see it's covered with corn residue, that's going to hold the soil. That's going to protect the soil. When you harvest a summer annual, there's nothing there. So I need to plan my crop so that I can get that summer annual off and then a cover crop in the ground. And it's become the point where now I'm dealing with the challenges of adding that cover crop as to not just a cover, but as feed for my animals. And so I'm planting more rye, more triticale, some things that can survive the winter and go into the spring. And that brings me to another aspect of the changing climate that we're dealing with is our winters, and we get the big snowfalls occasionally, but have become drier winters with less snowfall. I think it was 2 years ago where I didn't even need to plow the snow at all. I think we just had a token 2 or 3 inches. And when you are not farming, maybe that's a nice thing that you don't have to plow. But for me, I plant a lot of alfalfa, and bare ground in the winter can kill alfalfa. Alfalfa needs that blanket of snow to protect it, so it insulates it. So an expensive crop like alfalfa, which I count on to be the protein source for my cows, is becoming a harder crop to maintain. My father and grandfather could plant a field of alfalfa and it lasts 10 years. I'm thrilled if I'm getting 4. And it's meant that I've got to plant more every year. Instead of planting, 20 acres a year, I'm planting 60 acres a year to feed the same number of cows because the Mother Nature is not letting me keep that acreage as long. Other things that I'm dealing with are my cow's health. As the summers get hotter, it makes cows a little more uncomfortable. And the biggest driver in milk production is cow comfort. As odd as that sounds, it is true. If you drive across anywhere in Pennsylvania in the summer, you see cows out on pasture, they're all going to be huddled under a tree because the sun is hot and they want to get out of it. Cornell research has shown that cows, as soon as the temperature gets above 68 degrees, start to lose production from heat stress.
Wow.
So, cows are very susceptible to heat stress. On our farm, what that's meant is we've added a lot of mattresses in barns for our cows. We have fans over the cows, and we have sprinkler systems for our cows. That sounds great, but that's also highly energy intensive, and a lot of water use just to keep cows cool. Now, we're in an environment right now where water is not a problem for us, but there's many places where, with dairy farming, where water is a severely limited resource. And in order to keep cows cool in an increasingly warm environment, it's creating additional challenges. And some of those challenges are being met with different fan designs, and it's very difficult to keep cows productive in that fashion.
Brian, you have about a minute left.
I'm sorry. So where I see the future going is it's a big future in barn design and water use efficiency. We're going to have to look at how we're going to keep our cows comfortable, and the nutrition aspect of it is adapting our cropping systems to a changing environment. So I could talk about this for a long time because I'm kind of passionate about farming, if you didn't know. Well, I hope there's lots of questions after. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dale to go next. Dale Holen.
I'd like to spend a few minutes to talk about some of the changes that have been observed in lakes in the past 20 years, and some of the anticipated changes based upon climate change and increasing in CO2 concentration in lakes. But it's difficult to talk about changes in lakes per se because all lakes vary. They vary based on morphometry. Some lakes are deep, some are shallow. They vary relative to their chemical composition, depending upon the watershed that they're in, and they vary based upon the location. Those that are found up in the alpine regions will be altered differently than those, for instance, that are located at sea level. But some of the trends that have been occurring, we can discuss, and relative to temperate lakes. And one thing is, lakes have a high heat capacity, meaning it takes a lot of heat to change the temperature in the water column. But nonetheless, lakes have been increasing in temperature about 0.6 of a degree per decade. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it can have profound consequences on the ecology of the lakes. For instance, warm water holds less oxygen, holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. So that's a stressor for those organisms that are aerobes, such as fish, as the oxygen concentration tends to decrease. Ice out occurs at an earlier time period. So ice is melting earlier in the year, and a consequence of that is that stratification, which I'll discuss in a second, occurs at an earlier time period in the year and extends for a longer period. Typically what happens in the spring of the year as ice melts is the cold water from the surface sinks to the bottom of the lake. And the end result is the entire lake turns over. So the nutrients that have been collecting at the bottom of the sediments over winter come to the surface. There's adequate sunlight for growth of phytoplankton, and you get a phytoplankton bloom. And then over a period of time, from perhaps mid-June till September, the lake becomes stratified, meaning that the upper water column is relatively warm. It's highly oxygenated. There's a lot of phytoplankton, which are small algae, which are preyed upon by zooplankton. and there's a high dissolved oxygen concentration. As you go deeper into the water column, the water gets progressively colder. If you've ever been in a lake and jumped off of a pier and all of a sudden a meter or two down, you hit this really cold water, that's a thermocline. It basically sets up a barrier. Below that, the water is relatively dark. It's low in dissolved oxygen. The dead plants and animals that are in the upper water column that die during the summer, they sink into the bottom of the lake, and the nutrients collect there. Because of that barrier, they aren't suspended into the upper water column. So by having a longer stratification period, what's happening is there is a fear that towards the bottom of the lake, it'll become hypoxic or anoxic, meaning totally devoid of oxygen. And the only organisms that really can subsist in that type of environment are primarily bacteria, some anaerobic protists, and some other metazoans. And then in the fall of the year, what happens is as the climate changes, as it gets cooler rather, the surface water cools, it begins to sink and the lake turns over again. So the lakes in this area are dimictic. It's a very regular occurrence in lakes, and the fear is that if the water continues to warm as it has been, that the lakes may become monomictic, meaning they only turn over once, or they may become amictic, meaning they don't turn over at all, and would have a lot of dire consequences to the phytoplankton and the zooplankton and the fish as well as subsist in that area. Also, if the lower reaches of the lake become anaerobic, become hypoxic, what happens is a lot of the phosphate that's trapped in the sediments becomes mobile and is brought to the surface, and that feeds into algal growth. And so there's a higher productivity of algae, which is a good thing for fish, but as these, again, algae die off and they sink to the bottom again, and because of bacterial decomposition and a higher respiration rate because of increasing temperatures, there's a greater chance for it becoming hypoxic. Also, what they're predicting is a change in biodiversity in lakes as the water warms. Typically, there's a very seasonal cycle of phytoplankton as the as the lake becomes stratified. There's a group of algae that show up first. They're there for a period of time, and they're basically maximizing growth based upon the prevailing conditions. So they're there for a period of time. They're grazed down by predators, which are zooplankton. They're replaced by another group of algae. They're replaced by zooplankton, etc. And so this extends throughout the stratification period. And what they've been seeing in lakes, and they've also been seeing this in terrestrial environments, is this disconnect between prey and predator, that the prey become available at an earlier time of the year when the predators aren't available, thereby extending their growing season. So for instance, if there's an algal bloom and small cladostomes called Daphnia are not there to feed on them because of this disconnect. Daphnia are a primary food source for small fish, which are a food source for larger fish. So if there's this disconnect and there's not sufficient Daphnia to graze the phytoplankton, the end result could be a lower fish yield overall. Also, in regards to pH, this isn't necessarily a problem in lakes, but because of increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, there's more CO2 being absorbed in the ocean, and the end result of that is they're observing increased acidification. The pH is beginning to decline from like 8.5 down to 8.1, which doesn't seem to be a significant decrease. But if you go from a pH of 8 to a pH of 7 because of increased acidity, that is 10 times more acidic. There's a lot of small animals in the ocean called coccolithophorids that use calcium carbonate to produce these little houses, and calcium carbonate will dissolve at a lower pH. So they're not really sure what the long-term consequences of acidification. Also in the oceans, because of warming, the volume is increasing because warm water expands slightly, and that's partially responsible for the coastal flooding that we've been seeing. As Brian pointed out, we've had more precipitation lately, and with more precipitation, you get more runoff from the surrounding watershed into lakes. And not only sediment is being carried in, but nutrients as well. So there's a higher nutrient input. And if you have phosphorus and nitrogen coming into the lake, you get increases in algal growth. And what they're predicting is because of the warm weather and increasing nutrient load, is an increase in the number of toxic algal blooms. You may have heard of the algal blooms that are occurring down in Florida for the past couple of years by cyanobacteria, and they are favored in waters that are relatively warm and have high levels of nutrients, and they can be a danger to animals. The animals that drink the water laden with certain cyanobacteria that produce toxins can die as a result of that. So the end result, what they have been doing is beginning to place observations stations globally. There's an organization called GLEON, that's called the Global Lake Ecological Observation Network, and what they're going to be doing over the next 20 or 30 years is to monitoring the changes in lakes and seeing exactly what will happen, because it's difficult to predict, because as mentioned, all lakes tend to differ. But the overall result of an increase in air temperature, an increase in temperature in lakes, is an increase in eutrophication, meaning lakes are becoming more productive, which is not a good thing. You're selecting for certain species like cyanobacteria. Cold adapted fish species like trout at best could disappear, and you're getting less desirable species. So at the moment, we're just trying to figure out what the best course of action to take.
All right, thank you very much. Now on to something completely different. John Pulo.
Thank you. So one of the hard things about technologies is really trying to create a forward look, especially 50 years ahead. I think one of the things we all appreciate is the disruptive nature of technology. Who would have imagined where we are today with the digital revolution, and we're now carrying cell phones around with us, which 20 years ago were all simply toys, or certainly early artifacts of what was to come. But as a practical matter, there are quite a few technologies in the remediation space today that will have an impact on climate change if they're allowed to go forward. And clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the market economics and so forth, and the let's say the pathways to get there will be the challenge. Let's start a little bit with first with some statistics. Most emissions on a global level can be traced to electric power generation, which is about 35% in the U.S. and 28% globally, and transportation, which in the U.S. is about 27% of emissions, and about 12% globally. Another interesting statistic is that buildings also consume about 38% of the energy generated in the U.S., which really represents a substantial opportunity for conservation and thereby reducing emissions. We often think about ways of remediating emissions themselves, but a lot of the dialogue and debate has not really moved over to the idea of conservation. And by reducing the need for energy, we also reduce the opportunity for emissions as well. So it's kind of a two-sided coin. Fossil fuels still represent about 82% of the world's primary energy today. And when you think about emissions generally, there's 40 billion metric tons of CO2 which are discharged into the atmosphere every year. There's thousands of coal-fired plants, nearly 2 billion cars and trucks on the road, billions of tons of coal, oil, and natural gas are mined and combusted every year. There's 400 coal-fired plants in the United States alone, which pour about 1.4 billion metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. The CO2 concentrations now exceed 400 parts per billion, or per million, compared to 280 parts per million back in the Industrial Revolution. So we are breathing air that's very different than it was, let's say, 100 years ago. That's pretty amazing. Technologies that are out there, many of them we know what they are today, but they fall into two broad categories. On the newer and more emerging side, they have to do with carbon capture technologies. And on the other side, there are technologies that relate to renewable energy and other sources that reduce or, let's say, eliminate emissions completely. On the carbon capture and storage side, one of the more prevalent thought processes that are going on is the use of bioenergy coupled with CO2 capture and storage. And imagine this would be working somewhat like a coal-fired plant, But instead of coal, we would be using things like recently grown energy crops like switchgrass and fast-growing trees, which initially had to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is what plants do. But then if you couple that with a capture technology, then you can see how you could begin to affect the absolute reduction of emissions overall, on one hand, naturally, and secondly, artificially. Another area is enhancing natural methods for capturing CO2. And as I mentioned earlier, forests and on land and sea also help pull CO2 out of the air and incorporate it into things like trees and kelp and even microscopic diatoms, as we were talking about earlier. There are new genetic techniques and other manipulations that may enable scientists to actually enhance photosynthesis itself, allowing plants to capture more CO2 as well as to yield more food, fiber, and fuel. So simply enhancing the ability of plants to capture and retain CO2 could actually help remedy the CO2 challenge significantly, and as would increasing the world's fertile soils, or that's which is buried beneath the sea. Another interesting diversion in carbon capture is actually machines that will suck CO2 out of the air. So imagine an artificial tree, which is, and in this case, a device that would actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's actually been such machines that have been demonstrated in Switzerland and in the dry desert in Phoenix, and as well as the forested hillsides of British Columbia. But it would take something like 100 million of these artificial trees to actually do the job to remediate something like 40 million metric tons of CO2. But the point is that that's the stasis today with respect to where the technology is. You can imagine the efficiencies over time that would be created if this technology were to advance. Power generation from sources that don't emit CO2, and including renewable sources, we include certainly things like wind and solar, which supply about 1% of the world's energy needs, but are growing at something like 15 to 40% a year. And there are challenges in these technologies, typically because in the case of solar, the conversion efficiency of these technologies is pretty low, which means you need a lot of surface area in order to make them work. The same would be true of wind energy. And where you have to have situations where they can only be sited in favorable locations, and again, large land use to make them practical. So the long-term look is that it would likely be that deployable wind energy would only satisfy about 5% of the global demand for energy over time. Hydropower has been around for a long time, as we know. It supplies about 2% of the world's primary energy, but about 40% of the hydropower's deployable potential has already been tapped. Certainly, there's been increasing resistance to dams because they can destroy upstream forests and agriculture, and downstream areas will see obviously the concerns about flooding. Nuclear, which has been kind of a favorite of mine. I was involved in the nuclear industry back in the 1970s when we were still building plants, but of course, the things that are uppermost in our mind are situations like 3 Mile Island and the potential for nuclear accidents and things of this nature. But there's been a lot of progress that's been going on in developing new designs for reactors. The trend is now towards smaller, more efficient, and safer plants. In fact, the Department of Energy has offered $8.3 billion in loan guarantees to develop small modular reactors. And if you could imagine these reactors being placed in even in largely populated areas in cities and so forth, one of the real problems we have in our energy infrastructure is that we tend to be concentrated in regions, in large power-producing regions. So if we could find a way to distribute energy production throughout the country, it would be a significant improvement not only in the safety but also in the security of that system. Another technology which is pretty interesting is fuel cells, which generate power electrochemically by combining oxygen with hydrogen to create electricity and water. And we've seen fuel cells in use since the NASA days. That's how they created power on most of the spacecraft in fact, all of the spacecraft that went to the moon and beyond. The interesting thing is that the scale of that technology in terms of its ability to generate power has been increasing significantly. In Japan, for example, the government is so bullish on this technology that they've earmarked $309 million a year for fuel cell development in 10,000 homes, 10 million homes, about 1/4 of Japanese households by 2020. So here's a case of distributed energy down to the home level. And I kind of look at that as akin to what happened with personal computing. In the early days in the 70s, nobody thought that the PC would take off. In fact, even IBM thought they'd maybe sell 100 machines per year if they were lucky. And now we have, completely distributed computing capability with cell phones and things of that nature. So if you could imagine that as a significant disruption in terms of how energy is generated. The interesting thing about fuel cells is that artificial photosynthesis has now been generated. There's a research group at Harvard with Daniel Nocera who has unveiled an artificial leaf, believe it or not, which generates hydrogen and oxygen from water that can be used to power a fuel cell. So it's coming, and obviously we all know where electric cars are going. The demand is increasing significantly. The real challenges there, of course, are battery technology, so we can increase the range of cars and the like, and be able to create infrastructure that would support that kind of technology. But the real problem today is that there's really no business case out there for carbon removal right now. It costs absolutely nothing to put CO2 into the air. So there's no financial incentive to stop dumping. And policies that send a clear signal to the market by putting a financial cost on emissions would make many low carbon technologies commercially competitive with traditional CO2 emitting technologies and spur companies to invest in developing new low carbon technologies. So the government incentives for consumer and business to purchase these technologies can help them enter the mainstream and contribute to substantial reductions in emissions. And the government will also have to invest in R&D as well. So there's a lot of policy prescriptions for that. I mean, there's been talk of putting a tax on carbon. Very difficult, obviously, in today's political climate to think about things like that, especially when the growth agenda looks at the potential impact on jobs and the like. Opponents of strong action to address climate change often focus on the economic costs of reducing emissions, but the cost of inaction is greater. In addition, the global technology will create opportunities for businesses and workers. My thesis is that in many ways business is going to take a lead in this because there's an opportunity to compete in a $20 trillion clean energy business, in fact, and that is a huge economic incentive for businesses to show the lead in that. And you see it already. When the Paris Accords were rolled back in the U.S., GE actually came out with a statement and said, we're going to have to do this on our own. And they're clearly a leader in energy generation technology there. So you see it happening everywhere. So I'm confident that we will see technological solutions to this. It's going to take a great deal of effort, not only on the technology development side, but more importantly in finding ways to match the market economics with the ability to leverage that technology into useful form.
Thank you very much, John. Next, we will hear from Bernie McGurl.
I'm going to just talk a little bit about our organization, some of our goals, what we've been doing over the last 30 years to address some of the legacy carbon issues in the Lackawanna Valley from 150 years of coal mining. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of our strategic views are looking forward, and some of our interactions with the community. As many of you know who are from the area, we have a history of coal mining in the Lackawanna Valley, and with the president's promise to bring back coal mining, we're really excited at some of those opportunities. So I think we have to use a certain amount of humor and joviality to talk about these issues, because the outcomes, if you really think about what science is telling us, are could be somewhat grim. I believe I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my personal beliefs as well. So I believe that climate change is inevitable, and I do not believe that we will have a significant enough impact in carbon reduction to reverse it in any way. So I believe we need to figure out how we as a species can adapt to it. It's going to change the planet profoundly. It's going to change local environments and local ecologies profoundly, and the ability of the planet to sustain populations, human populations and other populations in various areas is going to be profoundly impacted. Some biologists are suggesting that we're near the so-called sixth extinction. The rates of extinction of species are accelerating. But I think if we look back at the geologic record, we can see that the natural planetary cycles have occurred, and natural climate cycles have gone on. And I suggest that we're part of that, and I think we're a species that has an intellect, and we're sentient. We're the only sentient species, I think, that we know that's on this planet and anywhere else for that matter. So I think we need to think about ways that we behave and we adapt and try and make those more of a common practice. We can see with 150 years of carbon extraction in the Lackawanna Valley that industry and that behavior has really messed up our environment, and that's part of what we're dealing with. We have a river that flows down from the Appalachian Plateau and into the Ridge and Valley region through the Lackawanna Valley. And underlying our valley is one of the richest deposits of anthracite coal in the world, the northern anthracite coal field. It was heavily mined beginning in 1820 and proceeding up until effectively November the 1st, 1961. That was the date that the Moffett Coal Company notified the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that they were turning off the pumps, and they were operating the pumps of their own company under Taylor and Scranton, and they were also operating the pumps of the Hudson Coal Company, the Glen Alden Coal Company, and the Reading Anthracite Company, and a couple smaller operations. All those bigger companies had started to go out of business in the late 1950s, and they had an agreement amongst themselves that the last guy standing would operate the pumps in the other mines to keep their mines dry. So in 1957, there was an economic intersection where the cost of running the pumps in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre minefield were actually exceeded the cost of, or the price available on the market for coal. So at that point, you weren't making any money mining coal under Scranton or Wilkes-Barre. A couple years later, we had the Knox mine disaster in Pittston, and that was a very, very much a sad. There were 12 miners killed, but an effective coup de grace on the industry. But the handwriting had been on the wall for many years previous. So once the mine pumps were turned off in 1961, over the winter of 61-62, the mines under Scranton and Old Forge and Archbald and Carbondale began to fill with water. And that water was coming out the old outlets where the mines were discharging it previously, but it was also coming out open mine shafts and boreholes everywhere, and supersaturating the groundwater in the lower Lackawanna Valley around Old Forge and Duryea and Moosic, and causing a lot of public health and safety problems and flooding basements. And so the state of Pennsylvania came in and working with mining engineers, the state drilled a borehole in the riverbed in Old Forge, and it's now known as the Old Forge borehole, and it discharges 60 million gallons of water every day from the flooded mines under Scranton. And that 60 million gallons has about 7,000 pounds of iron oxide dissolved in it, and it's crystal clear. when it comes out of the mine, and but the iron in there starts to precipitate and interact with the dissolved oxygen in the water of the Lackawanna River, and it covers everything for the lower 3 miles of the Lackawanna and out into the Susquehanna with the bright orange coloration of iron oxide residue. And that's been going on every day since that borehole went into operation in September of 1962. So we have a tremendous legacy. And then the water in the mines under Scranton, we've recently measured done some volumetric surveys. We're digitizing the mine maps, and we've created a three-dimensional model of the mine void system. And we've then determined from borehole elevation readings what the water level is, rises and falls a bit with precipitation. So we basically have a series of underground lake complexes under the valley that have effectively 3 times the volume of Lake Wallenpaupack. So we have 210 to 220 billion gallons of water residing in the flooded coal mines under Scranton. So we're looking to resolve those problems. We're looking at collaboration with private industry. We have a view that the governmental action is not sufficient, but determining if there can be progressive ways and enlightened ways of using science and material science in particular to resolve some of these issues and create products. We'd like to be able to produce 60 million gallons a day of potable industrial water and harvest 6,000 to 7,000 pounds of iron oxide product, which could have a range of industrial and technological uses. So we're also looking at the lower Lackawanna area as a sort of an eco-industrial park to create related industries that might be interested in some of those applications. And there could also be some energy applications down there as well. But looking forward, we're looking at one of the practices that we've engaged in is community involvement. Our organization's mission to conserve the Lackawanna River it also involving the community, involving our fellow citizens and organizations in that process. So we've got 63 municipal governments and authorities to deal with within the Lackawanna watershed, 4 county governmental agencies, and like those 63 municipalities or townships, boroughs, the city of Scranton, the city of Pittston, the city of Carbondale, and a lot of boroughs. So it's a lot of politicians, a lot of people to deal with, a lot of other conservation organizations. We work closely with Countryside Conservancy up here in the Tunkhannock watershed. We work in partnership with the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, which is a multi-county coalition of watershed groups and conservation districts that's based down in Ashley, and we've got a real sharp staff of young folks working for that organization. We're working with the Rail Trail Council and the North Pocono Trails Association. So all of us together, I think, need to look at what kinds of behaviors do we have, what are we producing, and what kinds of changes that should we be advocating for and thinking about in the next 50 years. One of the things particularly I think that could be a useful tool for us, and it's something that we're advocating now, is the consideration of the development of local stormwater authorities. The Clean Water Act from 1972 requires that we operate sewer treatment plants, and industrial facilities operate treatment plants that, if they are going to discharge any type of water back into the waters of the United States, they need to keep it, clean it up to a certain degree.
Excuse me, Bernie. Sorry.
Pardon?
You've got about a minute.
Okay. So getting permits for that is really critical, and our local governments don't necessarily have enough capacities to do that. So we're urging the creation of stormwater authorities, and I believe that those authorities can also have a role to play with adaptability and creating some resilience in our local government and local practices to manage some of the changes with the changes in climate that we want to see. Brian talked about the impacts of wet weather, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more precipitation events and a lot more critical precipitation events where we're going to have heavy flows and heavy rains and flooding. And I think those are some of the impacts that we have to deal with here, as well as looking at how we change our energy uses locally and personally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It strikes me after hearing all of you talk that some of our most urgent needs are to learn about the changes that are happening and also to adapt, both in technology and even in the ways that we operate annually in an agricultural context. And then ultimately invent, what are the new technologies that can help to remediate and also perhaps change the direction that we're going. I'd like to open it up for questions now. We have about 20 minutes.
Hi, this is a question for John. About 10 years ago or so, I heard something on the radio about climate engineering and the possibility of spraying water above the earth and problem solve. And then nothing. And then about 5 years ago, I heard something similar, shooting something else into the atmosphere. Is this, and then I kept thinking, well, what's happening? Why aren't we saved? So I wonder.
So what you're talking about is something called solar geoengineering, where they've talked about blasting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight away from the Earth, or spraying fine sea salt into the clouds to basically do the same thing. So to me, that's like the nuclear option. I don't think it's something that we would really like to try. The question would be, is something like that even reversible? And I think the potential long-term effects of that would probably not really be well understood. So I've read some of that in the literature, but frankly, that's a pretty drastic option. And I haven't seen much in the literature about promoting that as a potential solution. Thank God. I think in many respects. I think that's pretty dangerous stuff, at least from my perspective anyway. But it's a great question.
I would just first like to thank you. I wish there were 1,000 people here, because it seems to me that one of the things that is needed is more information and the passion and the clarity that you brought to this morning, blew me away. I'm an environmental junkie, and you just blew me right out of the water. The only thing that discouraged me was I can't believe that there would be technology to build products like virtual trees rather than putting the technology to support the actual efforts that we're doing. So, everybody join the Lackawanna. Vote and join.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You guys, man, I wish I had the money to pack you all up, give you stipends, and say, please, let's speak anywhere on street corner, because it was remarkable. And thank you to the coordinators for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was so pleased to hear about the diversity and your awareness of the changes that are happening. And, I don't know, most of us have such little understanding of the environment. And, we're well-meaning. I'll give you an example. In Florida, there was apparently some problem with, housing expansion. And so the nesting turtles were impacted. So everybody got together and did that. Now they have said the turtles are okay. The people won't let go. The mommies want to continue that, and they're stressing. They're making it out of balance. Nature is always in balance, and we don't. I don't understand natural law. But your awareness of yes, I need to plant diversity, because what's going to happen is, Mother Nature will have her way in the end. And she may be here without us. And so anyway, and I also think that, I'm talking about Florida now, that our water bills are so cheap. I think that, you know, we really, and water is going to be an issue. You know, raise the price of water, you know, figure out a way to help those who can't afford it. But until we're hitting our pocketbook, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to sit there because America is crisis oriented. It's going to get so bad, and then finally we'll wake up. So I thank you, like she said, for being enlightened. And I'm so concerned about not understanding this process of the balance of nature.
Well, to address that just a little bit, there is an economic driving force that influences agricultural greatly. And it's with adapting to what our environment is providing for us. To give you a little example, in speaking with how our changing climate and how the weather systems are affecting how we operate, on our farm, as a dairy farm, we produce a lot of milk and we produce a lot of manure. And we need to have a way to apply the manure to the land because it is my most important fertilizer source. Previously, with drier springs, I was able to apply my manure to the ground as liquid manure in the early spring and in the fall, and then get my crop in and crop off in a timely fashion. But with the wetter springs, I haven't been able to do that. So now people in the area, when you are smelling my liquid manure going out into the fields in the hot summer, it's because I've needed to adapt. And then when you're seeing me out with much bigger equipment that you would think is consuming much more fuel to get it out, as a farmer and as a business, we don't look at it simply in those terms because we look at the figures of our gallons of fuel used per hour and how many hours we need to operate that machine per acre. And so with the bigger equipment, I'm actually able to use less fuel and cover the same acreage. So when you are seeing the bigger farm equipment out there, somebody has made an economic decision that it makes more sense to have the bigger equipment out there to get the job done faster and a little more efficiently. And on my own small level, I moved from using a smaller tractor pulling a liquid manure tank to now I've got a really big truck. And the big truck can go over the road faster. It consumes more fuel per hour than my tractor did, but I'm hauling 50% more in my truck and going twice as fast over the road. So these kind of decisions are drivers. So in the end, my farm is becoming much more fuel efficient. And it is an economic driving force because fuel is not cheap. It's cheaper today than it was 2 years ago, thanks to a lot of the increased fossil fuel production. But we are still trying to use less fuel all the time and less fertilizer all the time. So I would much prefer to be using my manure and using my legumes. The manure is going to provide much of my phosphorus and potassium into the soil, and I use my legumes to generate a lot of nitrogen. And the manure has organic nitrogen and inorganic. The organic nitrogen is going to persist in the soil for a number of years and break down and be available. So all of these considerations, I try to use as little fertilizer as possible because that costs money. And I want to use my own sources. So that there is an economic driving force. Just like water, it costs money to pump water and to use water. And when we're cooling our cows with water, that's a kind of, we have to look at it, it's not really wasted electricity, but I would like to see a much more efficient way to cool my cows in the hot summer.
Also for you, I have a friend who's in agriculture as an educator, and I heard her talk about the fact that they are actually looking at breeding different kinds of cows to adapt to this heat. Is there any such thing like that going on?
Oh, there absolutely is. And if you were to look at, when I'm buying bulls, my bulls come in quarter cc frozen straws. I will get a sheet that would make any sort of baseball fan statistic blush because I know more about my cows, where they're going. The thing is all of those the breeding technologies and what is now referred to as the genomics that we're looking at. Every time you get an efficiency in something that's more heat tolerant, you're sacrificing something else. And to give a very strange example for it is the reason we have to dehorn dairy cows is because there is a correlation between having horns and having high milk production. Now, they can breed out the horns, but you lose milk production for that. And at this point, it's not worth doing that. So we manually take off the horns off dairy cows. If they can find a balance to maximize our production, because really we are in the business of making milk. If that efficiency, even if it was a loss in production, if the gains in efficiency balanced it out so we can maintain profitability, farms will move in that direction. Because we do look at this as a business. We were born and raised in it, most of us, and it's our family operation. We can't imagine doing anything else. But in order to keep doing it, we have to make some money.
Go ahead.
First of all, I heard this morning it's National Ice Cream Day.
Yes.
I'm just going to say what I've witnessed in Florida and the Lackawanna River, which is unbelievably beautiful in places, a lot of places. I think the cold water that does come to the mines, I think it helps keep the fish healthy.
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah. It's an anomaly. Yeah.
And I come across a lot of people from the valley, older people who played in the river 30 years ago and were the color of Bernie's shirt when they would get out after 10 minutes. But it's really, you can see your toes now, and it's clean. It's just, the wildlife is just incredible. Now, Florida, on the other hand, the turtles, there's so many places where the turtles did come up, but now the beaches are gone. So they'll come up, there'll be a little beach, and then the storms wash them away. So that's a big change there. And the red tide, I don't know if that's a bloom, that an algae bloom or something
Right.
else. But
A dinoflagellate.
It's terrible.
In the back?
I have a question for Bernie, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get the terminology right, but I think I heard you say that one of the things that you're looking into is the residual iron, something that
Yeah.
would have technological and industrial use, and I'm wondering what that would be, first
Mhm.
of all, and secondly, whether that's an incentive for local industry or even regional or national industry to invest in some of the things that you're looking at.
Yeah, well, yeah, we hope it is, and we think it is. I'm working with some private sector partners that have formed a company called Susquehanna Mining Solutions, and they've got some patented processes to passively harvest the iron oxide out of the water. The question is, we've got 60 million gallons of water with 7,000 pounds of iron dissolved in it. So how efficient is that one process? So we're actually looking at several other processes. We've been somewhat successful in the last few years in obtaining some Act 13 gas impact fee funding through the Commonwealth Investment Authority. That has enabled the acquisition of a 120-acre plat of abandoned mine lands just adjacent to the borehole area on the Luzerne-Lackawanna County border at Duryea and Old Forge. So that's going to become the footprint of the initial demonstration model of the treatment technology. It won't. We're going to have to ramp it up over the years as we start to experiment with the different technology applications. But harvesting the product and looking at the product, the Susquehanna Mining Solutions Group includes some researchers in academia with material science background and nanotechnology. Everett Carpenter, who's head of the nano research group at Virginia Commonwealth University, is involved. And he's interested in the particle size, the actual natural precipitation of the iron out of the mine water. It leaves a pretty uniform 90 to 100 nanometer size particle, which is sort of interesting from a iron oxide refining perspective. It basically, nature is doing a lot of the work for us with this process. So there's some interest in nano applications. Some of it could be metal coatings, and there's other applications for purified iron oxide in pharmacy and veterinary medicine, pharmacology. It's also got a use in different metallurgical processes for steel making, as well as it is an ingredient in thermite as a welding agent. So there's half a dozen different industrial product uses and some potential newer nanotech product uses that are being investigated. I don't believe that's going to be sufficient to pay for the treatment of that 60 million gallons of water a day. It's one element that we're looking at. So we're also looking at other opportunities to maybe sell an industrial water product. It could be used to tell the fracking industry not to be taking water out of the headwaters at Tunkhannock Creek or Mahoopany Creek or Wyalusing Creek, because those water takes, while they're permitted under the River Basin Commission rules, do deplete those water supplies and impact the natural habitat. So we're looking at, we can produce 60 million gallons of water a day. There's a railroad yard along the Susquehanna River at Pittston and Duryea that could be used to railroad tanker that water up valley and into the gas producing areas. So that's one of the other things we're looking at. There's a whole variety of we're calling it, I coined the term eco-industrial park, to utilize those water ponds down there in their flooded topsoil pits. We're looking at aquaculture, fish growing, vertical agriculture operations as well. So, and there may be more. So we're trying to establish the initial treatment works, and we're looking at involving additional property owners in acquisition of additional resources down there to initiate this. And it's right along the sort of amorphous iron curtain between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. So if we could make something successful there, it's right in the heart of the community. It could have a whole range of infrastructure improvement outcomes as well. The road network down there isn't the greatest. So we're looking at a need for a lot of that kind of stuff as well.
Well, speaking of iron curtains, I'm actually curious whether any of you care to comment on the theme of the gathering and finding the better angels of our nature. We met as a group prior to coming here today and talked a little bit about the theme, and I was quite inspired and struck by some of the things you all talked about. We only have a couple minutes, but I had hoped perhaps any of you would like to comment on the theme.
Becoming more unified?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in order to do that, we have to come to a consensus that global warming and climate change is a fact. I think most people believe that. But I don't think a lot of people buy into the fact that it's not a natural process this time. It's happening too rapidly. They can look at models and they can input the sources of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, and based upon their model, it doesn't match the increasing concentrations that we've seen. I mean, they have a record of CO2 concentrations going back 800,000 years, and it's regularly cyclic, varying right around 250 parts per million, and it wasn't until about the 1800s that it began to increase dramatically up to about 400. And there was an interesting statistic I just read recently that only 13% of individuals in the U.S. realized that 97% of climatologists, those who study climate change, are in agreement with a 95% certainty that the change in the climate is due exclusively to the burning of fossil fuels and human causes. And I think we have to come to an agreement that we are the cause of this. And the science is solid. I'm not sure if it's science literacy, but I think we need to get the message out for those who are I guess, climate change deniers.
Thank you.
I think the debate not debate, but the discussion we were having, at least from my perspective, has a lot to do with fear of change. And since we are all human and we don't like to see change, the reality is that public policy prescriptions are very difficult to craft around that issue. So it becomes very difficult to have a well-meaning discussion about the kinds of changes that would need to be implemented to make a significant shift in the use of technology and its effect on jobs and on economic growth. But I think the weight of evidence is on the side of doing something rather than nothing, because the consequences of that are pretty severe. I think there's really two issues that are going to drive perhaps the public policy debate, and are probably more well-reasoned than we give them credit. Business is often discredited with the idea that we're more interested in profits than people and the environment and the like. And I think that that perception is changing. Volvo, for example, just said that every car that they're going to produce in 2020 is going to have an electric motor in it, whether it's a hybrid or not. So you begin to see the not only the policy issue, but the ethics of the matter beginning to take hold. The other thing I think I see is changes in buying patterns by generations that succeed us, at least me, and which fall more directly on good choices regarding the use or conservation of energy, and the kinds of buying decisions that they will make, my son will make, his children will make, will tend to fall more in the responsible. The category of being more responsible to the environment rather than one that will harm it. And I think the responsiveness of that through the business side, the economy, and how public policy is then crafted, I have more faith in us than perhaps we give ourselves credit for. And so the only question is the speed at which this change takes place. That's really the issue, and how much of a crisis it really is. And clearly there's a very significant debate around that, but I think we all believe we're in trouble and we have to do something. So,
thank you.
I think I've talked about enough the economic driving force for what agriculture is doing for climate change. But what I didn't mention, I talked about earlier within our panel, so we were discussing stuff before meeting here, is for some farms, it is in their economic interest to deny climate change, which I'll give you a little bit of an explanation of that. And that comes down to how crop insurance works. When the government got out of the heavy subsidized portion of it, where they're actually just paying the farmer for essentially not producing a crop and moving towards subsidizing crop insurance, it is in many of the large row crop operations' best interest is to not differentiate or differentiate between weather and climate, and to continue to say that these weather systems that prevented me from planting every year are just an aberration and not it's a change in climate. And when the government is subsidizing your insurance bill and you don't have to put out a lot of money and get to claim insurance year after year, there needs to be a policy shift in how that works. I think as agriculture, as food producers, we do need some sort of safety net so that we can continue operating. But denying that we need to change how we operate, I think is shortcoming and has a lot of public policy that can change that.
Thank you, Brian.
And I'll follow on with the economic perspective on that as well, with things like flood insurance. I think years ago, floods were once every 30, 40, 50 years, and now we seem to be getting 500-year floods every 10 or 15 years. The damages from natural disasters, Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, particularly in the last 10 years, have caused an acceleration cost in flood insurance. FEMA has gone out and reevaluated floodplains and reevaluated recently built Corps of Engineers flood protection here in Scranton. So some of the areas that people thought they were going to be protected, they're still having to acquire insurance because FEMA doesn't consider the $40 million flood protection project in Scranton sufficient to protect people to that level. So when you look at larger metropolitan areas, Miami, the entirety of Florida, if you look at some of the projections of sea level rise, even at a moderate level over the next 50 years, the tenability of living in Miami, Palm Beach, any of coastal Florida is just gone. New Orleans, there's a real question whether New Orleans should have been rebuilt. I think the enormous amounts of money that are going to be required for flood protection and protecting harbors and sea level down there is really astronomical. It's going to be in the trillions of dollars. Protecting our naval bases and other coastal military facilities is going to be increasingly expensive. So these are some of the things that I know the Defense Department is looking at, particularly with our bases. But FEMA is issuing mandates in a bureaucratic way and conflicting with the Corps of Engineers. So we have a lot of internal dialogue to do to get our federal house in order. But at the local level, there's the decision making on where we live, where we can afford to live, in from a purely economic and banking mortgage writing perspective is going to be start to have a profound effect on some of that, even before the public policies do.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say, first of all, that this was fascinating. I'm afraid we have to end now. I really feel better informed and have kind of new ways of understanding some of the issues around climate change. And I'd like to say that I'm very inspired by the work that you all do and the thoughtful conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you again to Suzanne for inviting all of us. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be a part of the gathering. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like you guys are the better angels of our nation. I feel much encouraged by the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And also that our better angels would probably start worrying more about public policy in this area. We should be focusing on that.
Yeah. Oh, we have one more comment.
I'm just wondering if, since this is being taped, but CDs or DVDs, you could sell those, and I would be delighted, especially when I see this. I need to hear this for more than once. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.